Let's do a little test. On each side of the screen, a number of dots are going to pop up, like this, and they'll stay on screen for about 2 seconds. Don't press pause. All you have to do is pick which side has the most dots. Are there more dots on the left or on the right? We'll do it 4 times with different amounts each time. Ready? Go! Here are the answers. The interesting part is this. For the first 2 sets, your chances of getting the right answer were the same. Not so for the last 2 sets. Your chances of getting the right answer were actually higher for the 3rd set than they were for the 4th one. This is one of the strands of evidence that point to the existence of 2 separate systems used for numerical cognition, namely the object file system and the analog magnitude system. The object file system allows you to keep track of exact amounts. That's what you are using for the first 2 sets. Since you were able to keep track of the exact amounts, your chances of getting the right answer didn't change even if the number of dots did. But the object file system only works for small amounts, up to 4 items or so. Above that, another system kicks in, the analog magnitude system. That's what you are using for the last 2 sets. And what that system does isn't to track exact amounts, but rather it allows you to estimate them. And since you're estimating, there's a kind of ratio effect, meaning that the bigger the difference is between 2 quantities, the easier it is to tell which one is bigger. The difference in the number of dots was bigger in the 3rd set, 10 versus 15 dots, than it was in the 4th, 13 versus 15 dots, which is why your chances of getting the right answer were higher for the 3rd set. These 2 systems are found in humans, but also in a bunch of other animals, including some fish. The question is, how do these 2 systems interact with language? If you cheated and pressed pause during the test, well, first of all, how dare you? But more importantly, you had enough time to just count the dots. You didn't have to rely on the analog magnitude system and estimate the amount. You just bypassed all of that and counted the dots. But you can only do that because English has a counting system that allows you to. What if your language doesn't have a full counting system? What if it doesn't have any numbers at all? One such language is Piraha, a language spoken by a small indigenous community that lives along the Maici River in the Amazon. Linguist Daniel Everett, the main protagonist of this story, spent over 30 years studying the Pirahã, their language and their way of life. There are only 2 words in Pirahã that might express exact quantities, hue and hue, which might mean 1 and 2 respectively. The difference is in the pitch. The word that might mean 1 goes from high to low, hue, and the word that might mean 2 goes from low to high, hue, and I'm probably slaughtering the pronunciation, but well, I'm doing my best and you get the point. In his PhD thesis in 1983, Everett listed those 2 words as meaning 1 and 2, and for anything above that, there's the word báagiso, meaning many. And this would make Pirahã what is sometimes called a one-to-many language, meaning it has a word for 1, a word for 2, and a word for many. But that's about it. But over time, Everett came to believe that hue and hue never actually meant 1 and 2. What they meant was something more like a small amount and a slightly bigger amount. If he was right about that, then that would mean that Pirahã had no number words at all. It would be the first documented case of a language without numbers. This idea would gain some experimental support in 2008, when a group of researchers led by Michael Frank ran the following experiment with Pirahã participants. They took a spool of thread, put it on a table, then asked the participants, how many are there, to see which word they would use. Then they'd add another spool of thread and ask them again, how many are there? Rinse and repeat up until there were 10 spools on the table. The Pirahã all used hue when there was 1 spool of thread on the table, and they all used hue when there were 2 spools of thread. So far it's consistent with the idea that these words mean 1 and 2. But if that's what they mean, then what you'd predict is that starting with 3 spools on the table, everyone would use báagiso, the word for many. But that's not what happened. Some used báagiso, but others used hue, the word they thought meant 2. All the way up to when there were 10 spools on the table, some were still using hue, That being the case, it doesn't seem like hue means 2 as an exact quantity. Then they repeated the same experiment, but this time subtracting the spools of thread, meaning they started with 10 spools already on the table, then took them off one by one, down until there was only just 1 left. From 10 down to 7, there was a mix of hue and báagiso, same as before. The surprising result was with hue, the word they thought might mean 1. Some started using that word when there were 6 spools still on the table. They all used it when there were 3 and 2 spools left. That being the case, it seems unlikely that hue means 1 as an exact quantity. These findings support Everett's idea that these words aren't exact number words, but rather they mean something like small and slightly bigger. Next to that, Everett had observed that the Pirahã really struggled to learn how to count. He describes it like this, quote, "In 1980, at the Pirahã's urging, my wife and I began a series of evening classes in counting and literacy. My entire family participated, with my 3 children, 9, 6, and 3 at that time, sitting with Pirahã men and women and working with them. Each evening for 8 months, my wife would try to teach Pirahã men and women to count to 10 in Portuguese. They told us that they wanted to learn this because they knew that they did not understand non-barter economic relations, and they wanted to be able to tell whether they were being cheated. After 8 months of daily efforts, without ever needing to call them to come for class, all meetings were started by them with much enthusiasm, the people concluded that they could not learn this material, and classes were abandoned. Not one learned to count to 10, and not one learned to add 3 plus 1, or even 1 plus 1, if regularly responding 2 to the latter is evidence of learning. Only occasionally would some get the right answer." All of this piqued the interest of cognitive scientist Peter Gordon. In the 1990s, Gordon went to visit Everett and the Pirahã, and he conducted a few experiments to test the Pirahã's numerical skill. Most of them involved lining up AA batteries on his side of the table and asking the Pirahã to match that amount on their side of the table. But he did this in different configurations. For example, he just lined them up evenly and asked them to do the same, a 1-to-1 match. Or he'd line them up uneven, an uneven lineup. Or he'd line them up from right to left, but he'd ask the Pirahã to line them up from top to bottom, an orthogonal match, as it were. So here they have to be able to manipulate the quantities through space. Or he'd line them up, then hide them, and then ask them to match the amount, a hidden array, as it were. So here they had to be able to use their memory and manipulate the quantities through time. One last experiment he did was to put nuts in a can, one by one, so the Pirahã could see how many were going in, and then he'd take them out one by one, and each time he took one out, he'd ask, "Are there any nuts left in the can?" It's similar to the hidden array in that it's looking at whether they can keep track of exact quantities over time. What he found was that all in all the Pirahã don't do all that well with this kind of task if there's more than just 2 or 3 items. Some of the results were a little bit strange though. He found that they didn't do all that well for large quantities on the 1-to-1 match, but they did just fine for large quantities on the uneven lineup. Gordon speculated that maybe the reason they could do the uneven lineup so well was that they were chunking the total amount into smaller quantities that they could handle, like 2 batteries here, 3 there, and so on. But if they can chunk into 2s and 3s, can't they just chunk into 1? And if they can chunk into 1, why did they score so poorly on the 1-to-1 match? Turns out those results were probably due to the fact that he was working with AA batteries on a rough surface, so they might have been rolling around a bit and throwing the Pirahã off. Because in 2008, Michael Frank's team tried to replicate these experiments, but this time with a more stable, flat surface and items that wouldn't roll around. And they found that on the 1-to-1 match and uneven lineup, the Pirahã did just fine, even with larger amounts. If they can do that, then it means they at least have the concept of 1 as an exact quantity, which is interesting because they have the concept even if they don't have a word for it in their language. On the other experiments that involved manipulating the amounts through space and time, Frank's team found the same results as Gordon. Above 2 or 3 items, the Pirahã just didn't perform very well. Their findings were consistent with the idea that, above 3 items or so, the Pirahã were estimating the amount, rather than tracking it exactly. Later on, they managed to show that even English speakers performed more or less like the Pirahã if their verbal system was otherwise occupied. And all of that would feed into a wider academic debate about the effects of language on numerical cognition. But that's perhaps a topic for another day. For us, the important part is this. Gordon published the results of his initial experiments in the journal Science in 2004. In his article, he argued that this was an example of Whorfianism, the idea that language affects cognition and how we see the world. Everett disagreed. He didn't think this was the right way of looking at it. Instead of language affecting cognition, he thought it was culture affecting language. He wrote his response to Gordon in 2005 in an article published in the journal Current Anthropology. Everett starts his paper by examining a number of features of Pirahã language and culture, which on the face of it don't seem to have all that much to do with one another. Quote, Pirahã is the only language known without number, numerals, or a concept of counting. It also lacks terms for quantification, such as all, each, every, most, and some. It is the only language known without color terms. It is the only language known without embedding, putting one phrase inside another of the same type or lower level. For example, noun phrases and noun phrases, sentences and sentences, etc. It has the simplest pronoun inventory known, and evidence suggests that its entire pronominal inventory may have been borrowed. It has no perfect tense. It has perhaps the simplest kinship system ever documented. It has no creation myths. Its texts are almost always descriptions of immediate experience or interpretations of experience. It has some stories about the past, but only of 1 or 2 generations back. Pirahã, in general, express no individual or collective memory of more than 2 generations past. They do not draw, except for extremely crude stick figures representing the spirit world that they claim to have directly experienced. Each of these features are individually rather unusual, and in some cases possibly unique. To have them all together in a single group of people makes it all the more unusual. So instead of viewing these as an odd set of coincidences, Everett lays out a hypothesis to try and explain all of these features at once. Quote, grammar and other ways of living are restricted to concrete, immediate experience, where an experience is immediate in Pirahã if it has been seen or recounted as seen by a person alive at the time of telling. And immediacy of experience is reflected in immediacy of information encoding, one event per utterance. That's the core idea of his paper. Everett calls it the principle of immediacy of experience. The Pirahã culture values immediate experience, and that cultural feature is why their language is structured the way it is, why they don't have numbers, and so on. The main response to Everett would arrive in 2009 with a paper published in the journal Language by Andrew Nevins, David Pazetsky, and Silena Rodriguez. We'll call it the NPNR paper based on the author's initials. Personally, I found the NPNR paper to be a bit difficult to parse because, well, essentially they tried to argue against Everett from every possible angle. It's a bit cheeky, but if I had to summarize it, it'd be something like, you're wrong about all the facts, but even if you weren't wrong about all the facts, your hypothesis would still be wrong. And even if your hypothesis wasn't wrong, it still wouldn't matter because your hypothesis doesn't challenge what you think it does. So, yeah, they were trying to do a lot of things at once. Their stronger arguments, from my perspective anyway, are probably the ones where they challenge whether Everett's hypothesis actually makes sense and whether it explains the facts he observed. Remember, Everett is looking at a broad web of facts and is trying to find a single explanation for them. And at that level, his hypothesis intuitively makes sense, but when you zoom in a bit, it gets a bit messier. Since we talked about how the Pirahã don't have numbers, we might ask how the principle of immediacy of experience actually explains that. The Pirahã can't say, I see 2 swans over there. They can only say, I see a small amount of swans over there. But is there any sense in which a small amount of swans is more immediate than 2 swans? It's not all that obvious. Or if we take the lack of clausal embedding, and we'll get back to what that is in a second. But essentially, Everett claims that in Pirahã, you can't say sentences like, I see a man who's walking over there. Instead, you'd have to chop it up into 2 bits. I see a man over there. He's walking. And he says the reason for this is that you can only encode one event per utterance. But you can form sentences with clausal embedding like that don't involve more than one event. For example, if I say, the swan that I'm looking at is white, there's clausal embedding there, but it's just one event. And yet, I still couldn't say it that way in Pirahã. So the connection between the lack of embedding and this idea of encoding only one event per utterance isn't all that obvious. That's more or less the type of argument they have with Everett over whether his hypothesis actually explains those facts or not. I think it's fair to say that Everett's hypothesis in 2005 was something of a first pass, so it wasn't entirely fleshed out yet, and some of NPNR's critiques were pretty valid. It wasn't until later that Everett would lay out a more detailed model in his 2012 book, Language, the Cultural Tool, and then in his 2016 book, Dark Matter of the Mind. But what's more important for us is the debate over the facts themselves. NPNR challenged pretty much every single one of them, but the one that became the center of the debate, and the one we're interested in here, is whether or not Pirahã lacks self-embedding. And here we can get a bit nerdy. What is embedding? In its broadest sense, it just means putting one thing inside another thing. So take the clause, the big blue dog is always barking. The big blue dog is a noun phrase. It's embedded in a clause. The big blue dog is always barking. So a noun phrase inside a clause. So in that sense of the term, really all embedding means is that a language has some kind of hierarchical grammar. You can put one thing inside another thing. But there's a subset of that we could call self-embedding. Here the idea is not just that you can put one thing inside another thing. It's that you can put one thing inside another thing of the same kind. So for example, if I say, the big blue dog that lives upstairs is always barking, I have a clause, the big blue dog is always barking. And embedded in that clause, I have another clause, that lives upstairs. A clause within a clause, self-embedding. In this case, the embedded clause is in the middle, so it's called center embedding. But it can also be embedded elsewhere, like at the end of the clause, as in the sentence, I see a man who's walking over there. I see a man is one clause, and embedded at the end you have another clause, who's walking over there. Since it's embedded at the end, this kind of embedding is called tail embedding. But they're both cases of a clause inside another clause, so they're both self-embedding. Another example of self-embedding is when you have multiple possessives, like if I say Bob's uncle's car. I have one possessive embedded inside another possessive. And it's this, self-embedding, that Everett claims Pirahã lacks. In Pirahã you can say Bob's car, but not Bob's uncle's car. Instead of Bob's uncle's car, you'd have to say something like, Bob has an uncle, he has a car. You can't say, the big blue dog that lives upstairs is always barking. You'd have to say something like, the big blue dog lives upstairs, he's always barking. In English, if we embed a clause inside another clause, we use these little words like that or who. You know, I know that you know, that I know, that you know, and so on. In the 1980s, Everett had noticed that Pirahã just didn't have any words like that. Instead, what it had was a nominalizing suffix, meaning a little piece of grammar that you could tag on at the end of something and turn that something into a noun. That suffix was sai. So for example, I could take this Pirahã sentence, and I'll try not to butcher it, but I probably will. He of I kahai kai sai. Something like that, anyway. But first we have he of I. The verb means something like to see or to know, and it's conjugated at the third person with an intensifier. Roughly translated, it would mean something like he sees well, or he really knows. Then in the second part we have kahai, arrow, and kai, to do or to make, and then the little sai suffix we just talked about. Kahai kai sai would be something like to make arrows, roughly translated. Sentence might mean something like he really knows how to make arrows. But if you add sai at the end of how to make arrows, it turns all of that into a noun. So instead of how to make arrows, it'd be something more like arrow making or arrow manufacture. He really knows arrow manufacture, or something like that. If we translate it like that, it doesn't really look like a clause within a clause though, right? So it wouldn't be self-embedding. Arrow manufacture is a noun phrase. so a noun phrase inside a clause, which isn't self-embedding. But here's the thing. The line between what is an embedded clause and what is a noun phrase can get really blurry. Even in English, there's a spectrum. For example, on one end of the spectrum, I could say, he likes that I play guitar. That I play guitar is an embedded clause. Everyone agrees on that. On the other end of the spectrum, you might have something like, he likes the playing of guitar. The playing of guitar is a noun phrase. Everyone agrees with that. But in between, you can have things like, he likes my playing guitar, or he likes me playing guitar. What is me playing guitar? Is that a clause? Is it a noun phrase? There's a lot of disagreement over that, even in English. So it's all the more blurry in a language that is much less studied, like Pirahã. In the 1980s, that's how Everett had analyzed this "psi" suffix. He thought it was used to nominalize clauses, and you could then embed those clauses inside other clauses. In his 2005 paper, he still says this is a plausible interpretation, but he offers another plausible alternative. Quote, there are two plausible analyses for this construction. The first is that there is embedding, with the clause, verb, phrase, arrow make, nominalized and inserted in direct object position of the matrix verb to see, know, well. The second is that this construction is the parentactic conjoining of the noun phrase arrow making and the clause he sees well. Parentactic conjoining is a mouthful, but all it means is this. You have two bits of language that are related at the level of semantics, at the level of what they actually mean, but not at the level of syntax. At the level of syntax, they're just juxtaposed. There's nothing in the syntax to show that the two bits are related. It'll be clear with an example. If you drink and drive, you go to jail. Here the connection between the two clauses is explicit in the syntax. We have that little word, if. But if you wanted to use parentactic conjoining, you could just say, you drink, you drive, you go to jail. The clauses are just juxtaposed with one another. There's nothing in the syntax to connect those clauses together, but you still interpret them as being related, right? You infer that there's a if-then connection there, even if it's not explicit. The grammar is different in these two cases, but the meaning is the same. So if we go back to our Pirahã sentence, whatever it is saying is that this sentence translates to something more like arrow manufacture. He really knows. And the relationship between the two clauses is just inferred, the same way that you inferred the relationship when I said, you drink, you drive, you go to jail. Okay, but if that's all it is, then what's the psi for? If you're just juxtaposing sentences, you don't need that nominalizing suffix anymore. And here Everett revised his earlier analysis. He dropped the idea that psi was a nominalizer, and instead he argued that it was a marker of old information, meaning that psi isn't something you add to turn something into a noun, but rather it's something you use to indicate that this is something you are already talking about. So presumably in that sentence, when they say kahai kai psi, it means they were already talking about arrow making earlier on. I guess you could translate it to something like, he knows it well, that arrow making we were talking about. Everett then makes his case for why he thinks parentactic conjoining is the right interpretation here, with arguments based on word order and clitic agreement, and MP&R would argue against his interpretation based on the verb not being inflected, there being potential issues with the scope of negation and whatnot. Now, I'm not going to go into all of those arguments, cause, well, to be honest, I'd probably lose everyone if I did, but I did want to go into the weeds at least a little bit just to show that this isn't a simple question with a clear answer. Even Everett said that both interpretations, clausal embedding and parentactic conjoining, are plausible. In 2016, a team led by Richard Futrell conducted an analysis of a corpus of about 1,100 Pirahã sentences. They were looking for whether or not Pirahã had this kind of clausal embedding. They found that there was no non-ambiguous evidence for it. So, while it's not the only plausible analysis, Everett's idea that Pirahã lacks self-embedding is at least consistent with the evidence they look through. But what's the big deal? I mean, who cares whether Pirahã has self-embedding or not? Why would this spark a controversy? Well, some people argued that the lack of self-embedding in Pirahã falsified the theory of one of the most renowned linguists alive, Noam Chomsky. First, let's take a step back and do a quick primer on Chomsky's theories. Chomsky's ideas about language have evolved quite a bit over the years, and there have been a number of different iterations to his theory. But there have been some through lines, things that have remained more or less the same. Let's use what has become probably one of the most famous example sentences in all of linguistics. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. The first published version of this sentence is in Chomsky's 1957 book, Syntactic Structures. He uses this sentence to argue a few things. First, syntax and semantics, or if you prefer, structure and meaning, can be studied independently from one another. Compare colorless green ideas sleep furiously with furiously sleep ideas green colorless. Neither of these sentences make any sense. They don't mean anything. And yet, intuitively, you still recognize that the first one is grammatical in a way that the second one just isn't. So you can study syntax independently from semantics, and Chomsky's interest lies with syntax alone. He cares about the structure of language, not so much about the meaning. Second, he uses this sentence to argue against probabilistic models of language. He says, look, before I wrote these two sentences, they never occurred in English before, and so in terms of probability, you'd have to dismiss both of them as equally remote from English. And yet, you can still immediately tell that one is grammatical and the other isn't. Now, that specific argument doesn't hold up all that well to modern scrutiny, but regardless, the point is that from the outset, Chomsky wanted to focus on syntax only, on grammar only, and he didn't want to have anything to do with probabilistic models. Both of these things have remained true throughout his entire career. What he wants to achieve is something more like theories in classical physics, and he says this explicitly in Syntactic Structures. In physics, you start with a finite set of observations, then you use hypothetical constructs, like mass or electrons, and you use those to build general laws that allow you to predict future observations. Chomsky wants to do the same thing with language. You start with a finite set of observations, in this case, utterances, then you use hypothetical constructs like phonemes, morphemes, and the like, and you use those to build grammatical laws that you can then use to predict future utterances. To achieve this kind of theory for language, what he landed on was a branch of mathematics called computability theory. Essentially, he was looking for an algorithm for language. He views language as a set in the mathematical sense of the term. Like in the set of natural numbers, you'll have the whole numbers, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, but never 1.5 or 3.7. Similarly, a language is a set of utterances. All the utterances in that set are grammatical. The utterances that are not in that set are ungrammatical. The grammar of the language is the algorithm that generates all the utterances in that set, and only those. This approach to linguistics is what is called generativism. It harkens back to the works of French mathematician Émile Post. But in simple terms, you're looking for an algorithm that can generate all the possible utterances in a language. Hence the name generativism. The justification for doing this, for looking for a language algorithm, is usually something like this. Language is infinite, so our brain can't store all of it. Therefore, we must have some kind of mechanism in our brain that allows us to generate that infinity through a finite number of procedures. More on that later. If you're going to look for a language algorithm like that, one thing you're going to rely on is what David J. Lobina calls self-reference. For the set of natural numbers, in simple terms, my algorithm could be something like this, using Lobina's example. 0 is a natural number. If n is a natural number, then the successor of n, i.e. n plus 1, is also a natural number. So, if 0 is a natural number, then 0 plus 1, 1, is also a natural number. If 1 is a natural number, then 1 plus 1, 2, 2 is also a natural number, and so on. With those two simple lines, I have a procedure that I can repeat ad infinitum to generate all the natural numbers. It's more precisely an inductive definition, but we can call it self-reference in the sense that each number is defined in terms of the number that goes before. Or to put it another way, the algorithm can use its own output as input. The latest, and sadly probably the last, iteration of Chomsky's theories is called the minimalist program. The minimalist program is centered around an operation called merge. What merge does is that it takes two lexical items, or if you prefer, two words, and it merges them, hence the name, merge. And that larger unit can then merge with another unit, which can then merge with another unit. So you build sentences from the ground up in a process that is very similar to what we described with natural numbers, in the sense that each unit is defined in terms of the units that came before. Just like our algorithm for natural numbers, merge can use its own output as input. Now you could do this kind of thing for a single language, like English for example. But what Chomsky is interested in is an algorithm that could work for all languages, hence the name universal grammar. It's a kind of metagrammar. One way to think of it is that when you're a child, you start at an initial stage where you haven't been exposed to any particular language yet. Over time, you'll reach a final stage where you've mastered your mother tongue. The grammar of the final stage is just the grammar of whichever language you grew up with. So if I grew up speaking Japanese, it'd be the grammar of Japanese. If I grew up speaking Hindi, it'd be the grammar of Hindi. If I grew up speaking Arabic, it'd be the grammar of Arabic, and so on. But what Chomsky's interested in is the grammar of the initial stage, when you haven't been exposed yet to any particular language. And that grammar would have to be universal. It would have to be consistent with the grammars of Japanese, Hindi, Arabic, and so on. That grammar, the grammar of the initial stage, is what Chomsky calls the faculty of language. And here we have to introduce a closely related but separate concept from generativism, and that is the concept of nativism. The idea in nativism is that this algorithm of the initial stage, it's something that's innate. It's encoded in our genes. Those two strands are what define Chomsky's theory of language. Generativism, the idea that language can be defined by an algorithm, and nativism, the idea that that algorithm is encoded in our genes. But presumably, that algorithm isn't the only thing that we need for language. After all that algorithm will produce is grammar. It gets you the structure of language, but that's it. We also need things like a sensory motor system to perceive and produce language, and we need ways to form concepts and whatnot. To distinguish between all of those things, Mark Hauser, Noam Chomsky, and Tecumseh Fitch proposed a new way of approaching the question in a paper published in 2002 in the journal Science. For short, we'll call this paper the HCF paper. They made a distinction between the faculty of language in the broad sense, or FLB, which includes everything you need for language, and the faculty of language in the narrow sense, or FLN, which is only the abstract linguistic computational system. FLN is a subset of FLB. And in this paper, they came up with a hypothesis. We'll call it the HCF hypothesis. And this hypothesis is that FLN is the only uniquely human component of the language faculty, and that it is made up of just one thing: recursion. Up until now, I've been avoiding the word recursion. And if you know anything about the Pirahã debate, you know that recursion is the key word at the center of everything. Here's the thing. What we call self-embedding, so things like a clause inside another clause, I know that you know that I know, that's sometimes called recursion. And what we call self-reference, so the idea of an algorithm using its own output as input, that's also called recursion. So we have the same word, but it carries multiple meanings. One way to think about it is that recursion in the sense of self-embedding is about the structure of sentences, and recursion in the sense of self-reference is about the underlying process that produces those sentences. So, structure versus process. The concept of recursion was borrowed from mathematics, and in mathematics, it was also being used to mean different things, and that was causing some confusion. In 1996, mathematician Robert Sohr wrote, quote, "The recursion convention has brought recursive to have at least 4 different meanings. This leads to some ambiguity. Worse still, the convention leads to imprecise thinking about the basic concepts of the subject. The term recursion is often used when the term computability is meant. By the term recursive function, does the writer mean inductively defined function or computable function? Furthermore, ambiguous and little recognized terms and imprecise thinking lead to poor communication, both within the subject and to outsiders, which leads to isolation and a lack of progress within the subject, since progress in science depends upon the collaboration of many minds. If it was causing confusion in mathematics, all the more so in linguistics. The HCF paper never defined what they meant by recursion, and the debate around that paper was pretty messy as a result. It led some researchers to try and clarify the different meanings of the term and encourage fellow linguists to use more precise terminology. For example, Marcus Tomalin tried to clarify the term and suggested that, as it stood, the HCF hypothesis was simply too vague to be either accepted or rejected. If we take Chomsky's broader body of work, though, it seems likely that recursion, to him, means self-reference, and more specifically inductive definition. We already talked about the minimalist program and the operation merge. Chomsky would often say that merge works similarly to the algorithm for natural numbers. So that's probably what he had in mind. But nonetheless, the HCF paper didn't define the term. It's in that context that Everett's 2005 paper would become so controversial. There's a very real sense in which he just stumbled into the controversy, unawares. Before writing his paper, Everett didn't know about the HCF paper and the debates there had been around it. In 2002, when the HCF paper came out, he was off doing fieldwork in the Amazon. His 2005 paper did challenge Chomsky, but in another way. What he was arguing was this: if my hypothesis is right and Pirahã culture affects the structure of language this much, then it's a challenge to nativism. Grammar can't be innate if culture affects it this much. But that argument was quickly forgotten, as Everett's work was subsumed in the broader debate over the HCF paper. The question became, does the lack of self-embedding in Pirahã falsify the HCF hypothesis, namely the hypothesis that recursion is the only thing in the FLN? Everett would end up arguing that, yeah, the lack of self-embedding in Pirahã does have consequences for the HCF hypothesis. On the face of it, there's no particular reason why the lack of self-embedding in Pirahã would falsify the HCF hypothesis. Remember, self-embedding is about structure, and self-reference is about process, which is why some linguists think that Everett was just confused by the two meanings of recursion. He didn't realize that the kind of recursion he was talking about wasn't the same kind of recursion that Chomsky was talking about. To the extent that he was involved in the debate, which honestly isn't all that much, that seems to have been Chomsky's position throughout. Everett just misunderstood what I meant by recursion. And if that's true, then the whole debate is kind of meaningless. It doesn't matter if Pirahã is self-embedding or not, because that has nothing to do with recursion in the sense that Chomsky means it. But what Everett was actually arguing was a bit more nuanced than that. It was a two-pronged argument. Either the HCF hypothesis has to translate into recursive structures, into grammar of particular languages, things like clausal embedding and whatnot, in which case Pirahã falsifies it, or the HCF hypothesis is unfalsifiable and not worthy of scientific consideration. People who think Everett just misunderstood usually ignore the second half of that argument. In a Reddit AMA some 4 years ago, to the question, "What's the biggest misunderstanding about your work which you would like to correct?" Everett said this: "The basic idea is that I have misunderstood Chomsky to be claiming that all languages have recursive structures. I do not believe he claimed that. I believe that either all languages have recursive sentences, or Chomsky's claim is vacuous." As it turns out, both NPNR and Chomsky pretty much agree that it's unfalsifiable. Remember how we described how merge works? It takes two words and merges them into a larger unit. And according to NPNR, if a language has sentences with at least two words in them, then it uses merge, and so it has recursion. So, to them, the only thing that would falsify the minimalist program and the HCF hypothesis is a language where you only had one-word sentences. No syntax, no structure, just one-word sentences. Would that even qualify as a language? In any event, if that's the only thing that can falsify it, then yeah, realistically, it's unfalsifiable. On his end, Chomsky has argued that the minimalist program shouldn't be understood as a hypothesis, but rather as a field of study where the idea of innate universal properties serves as a guiding assumption. And this is where the conversation carries over into philosophy. From Popper's falsificationism to Kuhn's revolutionary paradigm shifts and Feyerabend's method, there's a wide range of opinions out there on how scientific theories actually work and what role empirical falsification plays. Depending on where you land on those philosophical debates, the admission that the minimalist program is unfalsifiable might be a fatal blow to the theory, or it might be nothing to lose any sleep over. Whatever the case may be, it probably doesn't make much sense to think that Chomsky isn't sensitive at all to empirical evidence. After all, we're talking about someone who has revised his theory multiple times over the course of his career, in part because of conflicting evidence. To explain his stance, it's probably worth highlighting that he called it the minimalist program. It's not a word chosen at random. It's based on the idea of research programs as defined by philosopher Emile Lakatos. In the view of Lakatos, what you have in science are competing research programs. Each program has two parts. First, there's a core theory that is immune to falsification. And around that core, you have a belt of auxiliary theories that are more malleable and that can be falsified. The core theory can't be directly falsified, but falsification does play a role. It's just mediated through the auxiliary theories, meaning that if the auxiliary theories are falsified, this might lead to some revisions to the core theory. So empirical falsification isn't completely out of the picture, it's just that it plays a more indirect role. If Lakatos is right, what you end up with is a picture where you have a variety of competing research programs, each with their own unfalsifiable core. But how then do we decide which theory to follow? Well, one way is to gauge their explanatory power. Those core theories are usually based on broad strands of evidence. In Chomsky's case, there are broad strands of evidence that support his theory, developmental evidence, linguistic evidence, evidence from cognitive science showing that language is processed hierarchically, and so on, all of which are explained by that theory. But there are also plenty of other strands that don't match up all that well. That's true of Chomsky's theory, but it's also true of every other general linguistic theory out there. In some respects, that just speaks to the state of linguistics today, and the fact that there's still a lot that we just don't know about language. For any set of observations, there's usually going to be several different theories that can explain it. Yet on the other hand, there is no single theory today that can adequately explain all of the observations out there, even for a single language. They all have their own limitations in terms of explanatory power. So anyway, there's that broader philosophical debate over falsification and what that entails for different theories. There's one last angle that's probably worth mentioning, where Everett's claims do collide with Chomsky's ideas. Remember how earlier on we said the reason Chomsky is looking for a language algorithm is something like this. Language is infinite, so our brain can't store all of it. Therefore, we must have some kind of mechanism in our brain that allows us to generate that infinity through a finite number of procedures. That's the justification for looking for a language algorithm. But if Everett's claims are correct, then Pirahã is finite. It's finite at the level of syntax. There's no mechanism to generate an infinite amount of sentences or a sentence that is infinitely long. That doesn't mean they can't express new ideas. As we saw with paratactic conjoining, there are ways to combine ideas without relying on syntax. So perhaps their language is infinite at the level of what they can express, just not at the level of syntax. In any event, if it's true that Pirahã is finite at the level of syntax, then Chomsky's justification for the whole generative enterprise kind of falls apart. To be fair, that's probably not as big of a problem as it sounds. When you try to formalize theories in mathematical form, it's common to make assumptions that aren't true. For example, when Newton worked out the math behind the tides, he assumed the whole planet was covered in water. He didn't take into account the varying depth of the ocean or the distribution of continents. Obviously, he knew about those things, He just made those assumptions to simplify the math. Likewise, for generative approaches to language, you can posit linguistic affinity just as a useful assumption that makes the math simpler. Language might not be literally infinite as Chomsky believes, but you can still use that assumption to generate some valid insights. And as far as the justification goes, you could probably just tweak it to something like, language is so large that our brains probably can't store all of it. Therefore, it must have some kind of mechanism that allows us to generate all of that through a small number of procedures. That's probably good enough for most purposes. But nonetheless, Everett's claims do pose a challenge to the justification that underlies generativism. So there you have it. On the theoretical and philosophical front, the debate probably isn't going anywhere anytime soon. Generative models will continue to collide with probabilistic and usage-based models, and nativism will continue to collide with cultural theories of language. The issue of unfalsifiability probably isn't going anywhere either. On the empirical side of things, though, on whether or not Pirahã has self-embedding or not, unfortunately that debate may never be settled. In her 1983 doctoral thesis, Elizabeth Michneau discussed how recursive structures in Quechua were very uncommon in rural areas and a lot more common in urban areas. The difference? In urban areas, Quechua speakers were in contact with speakers of the more dominant language, Spanish. The official Quechua, the towns, had started to use more clausal embedding like Spanish does. But in the more isolated rural areas, where they weren't in contact with Spanish, that wasn't the case. When Everett lived with the Pirahã, they were largely isolated from the outside world. That is starting to change. In 2011, the Brazilian government brought electricity, a clinic, and a school to the Pirahã settlement where Everett used to live. They teach the Pirahã how to read and write. Some are now able to write their names and recognize quantities in the Portuguese counting system. And just like how contact with Spanish affected Quechua, it's possible the same will happen with Pirahã. The political and ethical issues around that are beyond the scope of this video, but at the very least, from the perspective of linguistic knowledge, it's a shame, because it's yet another question that will be left without an answer as the object of study changes and ultimately disappears, never to be recovered. On December 19th, 2008, Carol Chomsky, Noam Chomsky's wife and an accomplished linguist in her own right, passed away. She and Noam were childhood sweethearts, and they had been married for 60 years when she passed. Everett wrote to Chomsky to express his condolences. Chomsky replied that it meant a lot to him. They perhaps weren't close, but they weren't strangers either. In 1984 and 1985, Everett had worked in the office next to Chomsky's at MIT. A few years later, when Everett applied for a job at the University of Pittsburgh, Chomsky wrote a letter of recommendation for him. And again a few years later, when Everett applied for full professorship. Their next email exchange was only about a month later, and it was much less friendly. Around that time, Everett was making the rounds to publicize his new book, Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes: Life and Language in the Amazonian Jungle. The book is an autobiographical account of the many years Everett spent with the Pirahã. If you're looking for a good book to read this summer, you should check it out. It's really good. It talks about his experience as an evangelical missionary who went there to convert people, but ended up losing his faith along the way. It talks about how the Pirahã live, but it also talks about the debate over recursion, and why Everett believes Pirahã disproved Chomsky's theory. As part of the tour for his book, he was interviewed by the Brazilian newspaper Folha de São Paulo. The interview was published in a lengthy piece in the February 1st, 2009 edition of the paper. Alongside it, there was a shorter piece where they had asked Chomsky to comment. In that piece, Chomsky was cited as saying Everett was a, quote, pure charlatan. Everett wrote to Chomsky and asked him, "Did you actually say that?" Chomsky said yes. Everett said Chomsky should be ashamed of himself. Chomsky said Everett should be ashamed of himself. And that was that, a proper falling out. By that time, the debate over Pirahã had been going on for a little over 3 years already. As far as I can tell, Chomsky wasn't particularly involved. At least, he never debated it directly or wrote any formal papers about it. All you have is interviews with the press where he'd always say more or less the same thing. Everett misunderstood what I meant by recursion, and the lack of self-embedding in Pirahã doesn't challenge the minimalist program. That has remained his stance throughout, more or less. Though, as we've seen, it seems unlikely that Everett actually misunderstood. The charlatan remark happens in the context of Everett's book, so perhaps I'm being too charitable, but to me, it seems like Chomsky's reasoning went something like this. Everett misunderstood, which is fine, but it's been 3 years now and he keeps on misunderstanding. And now he's making bank by selling pop-sci books that push that misunderstanding to lay audiences. And that's what led him to believe that Everett was acting in bad faith. Personally, that's how I interpret what Chomsky was probably thinking, but of course, it's debatable. Either way, once it was out there, it became the headline the press had been waiting for. The press, well, some of it anyway, had already been sensationalizing this story into much more than it actually was. They had inflated it into a David and Goliath story. And it's rather inconvenient for a David and Goliath story if Goliath never really shows up on the battlefield. So instead, some of them implied that Chomsky was secretly pulling the strings behind the scenes. Whatever any critic of Everett said or did, it was implied that they were actually acting on Chomsky's behest. They didn't feel burdened by trivial things like, providing evidence for a claim like that. We were just told it was an open secret. Next to that, they consistently upped the stakes with hyperbolic language. For example, in an article in New Scientist on March 18, 2006, Everett's findings are described as the, quote, final nail in the coffin for Noam Chomsky's hugely influential theory of universal grammar. Or, in the Chicago Tribune of June 10, 2007, they likened Everett's work to a, quote, high school teacher finding a hole in the theory of relativity. Not that the treatment Everett was getting was any better. Quite the contrary, it was much, much worse for him. Very early on, some of his critics tried to impugn his character with accusations of racism, a smear campaign that began with the old trick of truncating a quote and making indirect speech seem like it was direct speech. Everett had written on a webpage a sentence describing how local Brazilian traders thought of the Pirahã. He wrote, "The local traders say they talk like chickens and act like monkeys." In the hands of some of his critics, the local traders part of that sentence just vanished. It became, Everett believes the Pirahã talk like chickens and act like monkeys. And when you see that kind of thing, it's really hard to think they weren't being disingenuous. Like, come on now. Famously, in 2009, Selena Rodriguez outright called Everett a racist in the widely circulated German magazine Geo. The most famous outburst, though, was earlier, in the fall of 2006. Edward Gibson from MIT invited Everett to give a lecture to MIT's Brain and Cognitive Sciences Department, or BCS. David Pazetsky from MIT's Linguistics Department sent an email to Gibson. We don't have the details of this email exchange, but per Gibson's account, Pazetsky expressed concern over inviting Everett because of the reports of racist behavior on his part. The chickens and monkeys rumor was already making the rounds. Gibson invited Everett anyway. The lecture was formally announced on November 28, 2006, in an email sent to the mailing list for BCS and for linguists at MIT and Harvard. Immediately after, Andrew Nevins, I guess he did one of those reply all when you know you really shouldn't, but you do it anyway. To the email list of guests to the lecture, he wrote an email with the subject line, "Enough is enough." It opened with, quote, "Although David, Selene, and I are working on a paper about the linguistic features of Pirahã, I thought some of you should see some of the more obvious counterexamples to Everett's cultural claims before his talk at MIT on Friday, especially since we may not be allowed to ask questions without being cut off." He was talking about the famous NPR paper. It would be circulated as early as 2007, but it was only published in 2009. Anyway, Nevins then went on to imply that Everett was lying about the facts, and he concluded with, quote, "You too can enjoy the spotlight of mass media and closet exoticists. Just find a remote tribe and exploit them for your own fame by making claims nobody will bother to check." Not exactly stellar behavior on his part. Unfortunately, that wasn't the worst of it though. The worst of it came later, in 2007, When Everett learned that FUNAI, the Brazilian government agency responsible for the welfare of indigenous peoples, had a letter by Silena Rodrigues that expressed objections to his work. Shortly after, Everett would discover that FUNAI was refusing to renew his research permit. He was cut off. After 30 years of working with the Pirahã, he could no longer return. We can't say for sure what impact Rodrigues' letter had on FUNAI's decision, but it doesn't look good. Speaking of Rodrigues, a 2012 New York Times article says this, quote, "She declined to elaborate on the contents of the letter, which she said was written at FUNAI's request, and did not recommend any particular course of action," and that, quote, asked about her overall opinion of Dr. Everett's research, she said, "It does not meet the standards of scientific evidence in our field." Why it went down the way it did is anyone's guess. As far as I can tell, there's nothing in the content of Everett's claims that would really explain it. If you squint really hard, then I suppose you could connect it to broader debates. For example, it's pretty common to hear concerns about the potentially racist implications of certain theories. When people are claiming something about linguistic universals, the concern is usually about whether those are actually universals, or whether they're just projections of European features. And when people are claiming some kind of cultural or social determinism on language, the concern is usually about whether it's overwrought and whether it's drawing from stereotypes. Depending on their own intuitions, people are sensitive to different areas that might have racist implications. I don't find it hard to imagine that some people were genuinely concerned about Everett's claims, and I'm by no means suggesting that those concerns shouldn't be taken seriously. It's just that none of that would explain why things went down the way they did. For example, with Chomsky's earlier iterations of universal grammar, there were valid concerns that it was Eurocentric. They did what you normally do. They discussed it and tried to settle it by applying the theory to a wider range of languages than just European ones. What they didn't do is just call Chomsky a racist and dismiss all of it as a result, which is what some did with Everett. There are also valid concerns about the fact that Everett is pretty much the only linguist around to actually speak Pirahã with any real degree of proficiency. But I mean, if that's the problem, you'd think the reaction would be, we need to send more people to double check this, instead of accusing him of making it all up. So, as far as I can tell, there's nothing in Everett's work that explains why things spun out of control like this. It's all the more puzzling when you consider that Everett wasn't the first to claim that a language didn't have self-embedding, or at the very least that a language only made very limited use of self-embedding. Others had made similar claims about other languages in the past. Often these were languages of societies similar to the Pirahã, in the very general sense of being small, non-literate, and non-industrial societies. But similar claims had also been made for some of the big languages of antiquity, like Homeric Greek or Old Chinese. Everett also wasn't the first to claim that culture is causally implicated in the structure of language, and he certainly wasn't the first to criticize Chomsky head-on. Even through the medium of popular books, you look just at the recent past. People like Michael Tomasello or Jeffrey Sampson were making strong cases against Chomsky just a few years before the Pirahã controversy happened, and yet they didn't spark anywhere near the kind of controversy there was with Everett. So what changed? What was different in Everett's case? A big factor was probably just the timing. While recursion had always been central to Chomsky's work, the 2002 HCF paper really put that issue front and center. Everett's paper landed right in the middle of an already heated debate over the HCF paper. Media sensationalism probably didn't help. And beyond that, there might have been other factors, like petty turf wars between different schools of thought within linguistics, perhaps even between disciplines, like between linguistics and cognitive science. And lastly, it's also possible there was some bias against Everett on account of him having been a missionary in the past, and perhaps also on account of his social and class background. I tried to present the content of the debate without the dramatics, and to do so I had to leave quite a bit out. The actual debate was a lot messier, with some arguments leading nowhere except to impugn the opponent's character. From my perspective, that was especially true of how NBNR argued against Everett, more so than how Everett argued against them. But unfortunately, the dramatics really had an impact on the debate. it's not always easy to disambiguate the content of the debate from the context it happened in. As I understand it, this is due in large part to NPNR's refusal to work with Everett directly. Issues that could have been sorted out easily over a quick phone call were instead drawn out through tedious papers with accusatory overtones. As we mentioned earlier, Everett had done an earlier analysis of Pirahã in his thesis, which was later adapted and published in the Handbook of Amazonian Languages in the 1980s. And that earlier analysis was more compatible with Chomsky's theories. NPNR relied heavily on Everett's earlier work to argue that his new analysis was wrong. But they didn't ask Everett about it. They didn't bother to ask him which parts of the older analysis still held up or not, and whether all the examples in there were still valid. Everett has said that some of the examples in his thesis were wrong, that as a young linguist he had relied on unreliable forms of elicitation. If you ask a native speaker, can you say X? Sometimes they might just say yes just to be polite, even if they themselves would never say it that way. A big chunk of Everett's story is how he went from one level of proficiency in the language and analyzed the language in a way that made sense to him at the time, but later he learned more about the language, and in hindsight he realized that his earlier analysis was probably wrong. There's valuable insight there about mistakes field linguists might make. But in the case of Pirahã, it seems that insight is being ignored because of this policy of avoiding everything even remotely connected to Everett. In the mid-2010s, a young Brazilian researcher went to the Pirahã for a master's thesis and tried to elicit sentences to see if they had self-embedding or not. At no point did they consult Everett, the guy who had been working on the language for 30 years. They concluded that the Pirahã had self-embedding, just like Everett had in the 1980s. From Everett's perspective, it's just a new generation not proficient at all in the language, and they're repeating the very same mistakes he had made in the past. The other impact of all the dramatics is on the way the debate was communicated to general audiences. The framing of a death match between Chomsky and Everett has made it so that even now, many people feel like they have to connect their opinion about recursion to whichever opinion they happen to hold about the individuals involved. It's to the point where people's opinion about the people tend to overshadow their opinion about the actual debate. The accusations of racism and charlatanry have left a lingering scent on Everett. Even people who agree with him might qualify that opinion by saying things like, even though I agree with him, Everett's still kind of racist and still kind of blinded by money. As the behavior of NPNR and others was attributed to Chomsky himself, that has fed into a broader narrative of Chomsky, the egomaniacal bully who knows his entire life's work is all wrong, but his ego is so large he just can't admit it. And these broader narratives about the people involved, unfortunately they've ended up obscuring what the underlying debate was actually about. Which is a shame because, well, to me at least, it really was an interesting debate, albeit a rather confusing and muddled one. I hope to have presented the debate in a way where you can disconnect it from the narratives about the people, and in a way where it's clear that these are difficult questions that haven't been settled yet. Obviously, it doesn't preclude having strong opinions about it, and even having strong opinions about the protagonist. But, well, a little epistemic humility never hurt anyone. There you have it. Next up is another classic topic of language YouTube. What is the world's hardest language? Instead of offering an answer like, this is the hardest language and here's why, I'm going to treat it as an open question and go through all the different dimensions and factors that might come into play. So there's not going to be a single definitive answer, but we're going to cover a lot of ground. Stuff like differential complexity, whether or not complexity maps onto difficulty, linguistic distance, both objective and in the mind of learners, and so on. So, lots of different pieces that come together around that question. Alright, thanks for watching and hope to see you next time.